Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video I'm going to be looking at President Johnson and in particular looking at the issue of civil rights. So we're going to be looking at events and impacts on African Americans in both the northern and southern states of the USA during Johnson's term in office. Now this is designed for A-level history students, in particular people studying the Unit 2Q. And in the section on Johnson's president, the bullet point says African Americans in the North and South, developments in the civil rights movement, Johnson's role in passing civil rights legislation, the impact of change including urban riots. So if fulfilling kind of the brief of what I do on this that's what I'm going to go through, and we'll look at all those different elements and look at some of the detail and also talk about some of the evaluation and potential questions you could come across in this area. So to start off with, we're going to look at developments in the civil rights movement. So following the success in targeting Birmingham, in which there had been a strong negative reaction, so in particular the picking of Bull Connor and the extreme way he reacted and how that brought maximum media coverage, this was a tactic the civil rights movement looked to repeat. And it was one of the key moments that then led to the March on Washington and the Civil Rights Bill being put in front of Congress. So to continue that pressure, they looked to kind of repeat it and find other places where they could get a similar reaction to the one that they got in Birmingham. So one place they targeted was St. Augustine in Florida, which was targeted in early 1964. The SCLC and the NAACP worked together to organise sit-ins, swim-ins, etc. So essentially they went to segregated facilities and to provoke a kind of an angry reaction, and there was an incredibly angry and violent reaction from locals, also involvement of the Klan, and this maintained the pressure on Johnson to act, to kind of show that this kind of violent reaction to those who opposed segregation was still happening, and again this helps push Johnson to continue with his attempts to pass the Civil Rights Act. Now, one of the other key areas of development in this period of time is determination to bring out the black vote. And one of the key examples of this in '64 was in Mississippi. Only 6% of the African Americans in Mississippi were registered to vote. In the summer of '64, the SNCC and CORE decided to do something to change this. Robert Moses from SNCC organised for white student volunteers to join black activists in local campaigns. Despite the cost and the risks, thousands volunteered, receiving training in Ohio, and then went into Mississippi to teach literacy and civics at the 41 freedom schools that were set up and to help register black voters. As I said, there was lots of risks and costs involved in this, and it took great bravery, as there was a very high risk of facing both violence and arrest. The activists who went down also promoted the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or the MFDP, which was to challenge the all-white delegation to the Democrat National Convention. It was led by a very significant campaigner, Fannie Lou Hamer, and it had a degree of success. They actually managed to get some of their delegation into the Democratic National Convention. There was some, lots of horrendous events, however. So behind the success, there's the other side of it. So 2 white volunteers and 1 black activist disappeared and then were later found dead by the FBI following an investigation. There were over 1,000 arrests of campaigners. 80 campaigners reported being beaten. 37 black churches were bombed. 17,000 black residents tried to register to vote, but only 1,600 were approved. SNCC was frustrated by the federal government inaction and the fact that, again, all the media focus, rather than following them, remained on King, who in this year won the Nobel Peace Prize. So this gives us a hint into some stuff that we'll talk a little bit more about later, which is some of the divisions within the civil rights movement. So SNCC, kind of a real proper grassroots movement here in Mississippi. Again, some success, but also some horrendous things happening, and showing in a way that the huge barriers to the civil rights movement at this point, with the negative reaction that they faced. One of the most famous events of this period happens in Selma, Alabama in 1965. The town sheriff, Jim Clark, was seen as a good target against similar ideas to the targeting of Bull Connor in Birmingham. As again, they believed Jim Clark was likely to react violently to protests. And the Civil Rights Act had passed, but it failed to address the issue of voting rights. Half the population in Selma, about 15,000 people, so the total population of Selma was 30,000, but half the population were African American, but only 23 African Americans were registered to vote. King went to Selma, led a march to the Selma County Court of people who wanted the vote. Marchers were beaten and even had live snakes thrown at them. A young black man was shot as he tried to defend his mother. 3,000 protesters were arrested, including King, who made a quip about the jails in Selma having more African Americans in them than there were registered African American voters. Following his release, King organised a second march that was going to take place from Selma to Montgomery. But the state troopers attacked the marchers with clubs and tear gas in an event which went on to be known as Bloody Sunday, and this was seen as the key trigger for the Voting Rights Act. So in this we can see some of the tactics which we've seen working in 63, continuing into 64 and 65, and bringing about two hugely significant bits of civil rights legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. And again, King heavily involved in events and therefore hugely significant, but part of the divide in the civil rights movement that's developing is between the SCLC and King, with the other groups like SNCC, who are kind of feeling that all the funding, all the attention goes to King, and they get largely ignored. So, as I said, we talk a bit about this kind of division in the movement. The SNCC disliked the media focus received by King, and they also said, well, whilst they kind of stayed on the ground and worked with the local populations, the SCLC tended to go in, provoke in these areas, leaving huge amount of tension and difficulty behind, and then just move on and take the media somewhere else. And the SNCC were kind of left to try and resolve some of the problems. They were also the SCLC was receiving the majority of the donations, and they also, as the mid-60s moved on, were starting to kind of focus more of their campaigns in the north, which meant that a lot of the issues which had been partly addressed in the south but not completely resolved were kind of being pushed to one side. In the other more radical side of the movement, we've got the Nation of Islam, which was hugely shaken in this period, with Malcolm X leaving the movement. He clashed with Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, when Malcolm X made the comment about chickens coming home to roost after Kennedy's assassination. But we also see Malcolm X clashing with other members of the leadership because of Malcolm X's high media profile. We also see him attacking and falling out with Elijah Muhammad over Elijah Muhammad's extramarital affairs, and he talks about finding out that Elijah Muhammad had feet of clay, I think is how Malcolm X expressed it. So he's very much kind of disappointed and disillusioned with the Nation of Islam. And then he goes on a kind of quest of personal discovery, really, does Malcolm X. He goes on a pilgrimage to Mecca. He became a Sunni Muslim. He changed his name again to Al-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz and set up two new organisations, the Organisation of African American Unity and Muslim Mosque Inc. And we see a kind of changing attitude of Malcolm X at this point. So we see his views softened, particularly moving away from his earlier criticism of King and King's part of the movement, and retracting those criticisms while increasing his criticisms of the Nation of Islam. He's then shot on stage in 65 by two gunmen from the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad denied direct involvement, but Elijah Muhammad did say that Malcolm X got what he deserved. So we see here the potential fatal, the fatal consequences of some divisions within the movement, and we kind of see the most kind of more radical side of the movement in the guise of Malcolm X kind of taking a step back towards King and King's method of doing things. So that's not to say that a more radical approach within the movement goes away. Again, we're also already starting to see tensions between SNCC and Martin Luther King at this point. So we've got this big question about Johnson's role in passing civil rights legislation, and I think it's important to note Johnson does some really important stuff. So he oversaw the passing of the '64 Civil Rights Act. Of course, there's a bit of a debate about who gets credit for the Civil Rights Act. Does it go back to Kennedy, where it starts as a bill, or is it really Johnson? And Johnson's expertise with Congress, which is the important bit, as he managed to get it through. I mean, he overcame a 54-day attempted filibuster by the Dixiecrats, which included Richard Russell, who'd been so significant in Johnson's earlier career. The bill had 68% public approval rating, but there were some dire consequences for Johnson and the Democrat Party in passing the bill. It cost the Democrats support in the Deep South, and actually this support in the Deep South is something they've not recovered. The act made all acts of de jure segregation a federal crime, and also led to the killers of the Mississippi Vote activists I mentioned earlier. They were tried in federal court with denial of civil rights, which was a federal crime. Again, terrible, sad things about this. It showed that really the state courts couldn't be relied on. The state systems couldn't be relied on. So in anything in dealing with civil rights properly, the federal government had to take control, because the white governments in the South were and officials were not going to do so. And it proves the case not only with the Civil Rights Act but also with the Voting Act. The Voting Rights Act of '65 made all voting registrars federal employees, which meant that any attempts that they made to deny black voters the vote would mean that they would be dealt with by federal officials rather than by state officials. And it also removed all the kind of lingering tests and other methods that we use to prevent black people from voting. So it removed all literacy and other types of tests, such as essential tests on the Constitution, or state Constitution, or federal Constitution, or civics, essentially, as well as poll taxes. And there was an immediate leap and a huge jump in African American voter registration. By '66, only 4 states had less than 50% of their black voters registered. I mean, if you compare that to what we were seeing in places like Selma in '65, this Voter Rights Act of '65 has been in the news in American politics far more recently. I mean, there are elements of this which are being debated. So the Supreme Court has essentially said some of the elements of this has lapsed, and have pointed to the fact that Selma now has a black mayor. But there are arguments from the Democrat side that actually a lot of the southern states still require a degree of federal oversight when it comes to things like voter registration, and are talking about voter suppression in some areas now that the protections of the Civil Rights Act have lapsed to some degree. We also see the Civil Rights Act of '68, which outlawed discrimination in the sale or rental of houses, because again, although there was, we've seen a removal of the idea of legal segregation in terms of public places and things like that. You were often still seeing it in housing, where people refuse to either sell or rent properties to people based on race. And so the '68 Civil Rights Act is another important step forward. So Johnson has, in this way, a very good record. He has passed 3 significant pieces of civil rights legislation which have very important long-term impact, and certainly move the situation of civil rights forward. And it is arguable, definitively arguable, that President Johnson did more for civil rights than any other president, and that he did this despite it knowing it would cost him and his party support in the South, something which has not returned. And again, if you look at American politics today, you will still see a kind of fairly rock solid support for the Republican Party in the Deep South, and this dates back to this very, very significant move by Johnson. So Johnson does quite a lot. Now, the difficulty with all of this is really going to go, well, but does he do enough? And I'm not sure that really he does, or maybe even with some of the attitudes in American society, whether that was actually possible to solve some of these issues that he was trying to act upon at this particular moment in time. So the next bit I'm going to talk about is some of the impact of change, including urban riots. So from 65, the SALC looked to target economic inequality in the North and across the United States. King headed to Chicago in 66, but it was a fairly poorly planned campaign, had little impact. I mean, there was some rather unpleasant impacts on King himself. Got hit by a rock as he marched through part of a march through a white working class area. But I mean, there was very bits that fell apart. So the local authority, so really kind of the mayor. The mayor was kind of closely linked with Johnson. King was going to kind of make a show by moving his family into a ghetto apartment, but this didn't kind of get the publicity that he was hoping for, because the landlord got word of this and quickly refurbished the apartment to make sure it was of a good standard before King and his family moved in. So King didn't really have any clear aims on exactly what he was going to achieve, and he kind of left Chicago and left Jesse Jackson in charge, and took over the campaign. Johnson made some money available for some stuff on urban renewal, about $4 million, but this was nowhere near enough to deal with the significant problems that there were. In 66, King's focus was shifted following the shooting of James Meredith, and King and other civil rights leaders set off to complete Meredith's march for him. On that march was also the SNCC leader, Stokely Carmichael, who was the originator and advocate of Black Power, and calling for more militant actions. And some of the call for more militant action, some of the provocative and often kind of violent language used by Stokely Carmichael started to cause a rift with King and his method, and we start to see the movement dividing, splitting over some of this. Again, we see some plans put forward by King, largely again focusing around poverty. So he planned a big protest in Washington, bringing together poor people of all races. He received encouragement from Bobby Kennedy, who was pointing to the idea that the issues of race and poverty should be at the top of the agenda, rather than issues which were on the top of most people's agenda by this point, such as Vietnam. Unfortunately, the action of this, and we'll never know the impact it could have had, because King was assassinated before the protests could start, and this resulted in riots across the USA. And so at this point we see race relations are still a tinderbox. They're still very, very very difficult at this point in time. The worst of the riots followed King's assassination. However, the riots had been taking place in urban areas across the United States even before this. So whilst Johnson believed he'd done a great deal for African Americans in the civil rights movements and the civil rights movement could demonstrate clear gains, there was still much anger amongst the African American population, because although some of the legal things had changed, actually the attitudes amongst the white population hadn't changed enormously in a lot of cases, and the lives of African Americans hadn't significantly improved. In the urban riots between 65 and 72, there were 250 deaths, 10,000 serious injuries, about 60,000 arrests. In 1965 alone, there were $40 million worth of damages done. So there was really significant urban unrest, and a lot of this was sparked in the ghettos across America, and in particular in reaction to Martin Luther King's assassination. One area where there was then some serious work done to try and look at the causes was in following the riots in Detroit. Now, Detroit had been seen as an area, a city of relative racial integration and calm. So the fact there was rioting there was seen as even more significant. The governor of Illinois, Otto Kerner, was commissioned by Johnson to complete a report on the causes. His report came up with 12 reasons for the riots. He divided them into 3 levels of intensity. At the highest level, he said the most significant problems were police practices, unemployment or underemployment, so where people had work but not enough work or regular enough work to support themselves, and inadequate housing. So they were seen as the 3 kind of most significant parts or causes of the riots. In the next section, he talks about inadequate education, poor recreational facilities for the population, an ineffective political structure, particularly in addressing complaints and issues raised by the black community. And then finally, in the final tranche, as significant issues but not as significant as the earlier ones, he talks about disrespectful white attitudes towards the black community, discriminatory administration of justice, inadequate federal programs to support people, inadequate municipal services, so the stuff provided by the city, and discrimination in both credit and consumer practices. So, for example, African Americans found it much harder to get loans and credit and business and help setting up businesses, things like that, and were treated differently when trying to buy things, and then finally inadequate welfare. The report concluded that the US was essentially becoming 2 unequal societies, kind of mirroring some of the words there of Plessy versus Ferguson, and we see here that what he said is that essentially there was increasingly a white America and a black America, and these societies were separate and not equal. So a really damning report and a real insight into why there were the riots and essentially why there was this wide-scale dissatisfaction amongst the African American population in the US. So yes, there had been civil rights acts, but actually the day-to-day experience of black America was one of unequal treatment, poverty, unemployment, and discriminatory practices. And there was great demands to do something about this, and not enough was being done, hence the rioting. So to try and kind of pull all this together, Johnson felt a kind of personal affront, first of all from King, who he'd worked closely with, and who then, to Johnson's mind, turned on him with his anti-Vietnam protests, and the civil rights movement a whole, attacking the amount of progress made in civil rights under Johnson. So Johnson essentially takes offence at this. Interesting, underlying it, King's process and movement moves towards tackling the idea of poverty and inequality. Well, actually, Johnson's dream was of this great society, and what he really wanted to do was to tackle poverty, which he saw as the great ill in America. And his great society, if it had been fully achieved, I've done a video before on Great Society, might well have lessened some of the problems, some of the issues raised in the commission that looked into the rioting. But the enormous cost of the Vietnam War meant that there was inadequate money available for the Great Society project, and therefore the Great Society was hampered, and this probably meant that not as much was done that Johnson wanted to do about inequality. A lot of those issues he'd done over inequality based on poverty would have helped large numbers of the African American population. So Johnson, I think, probably you could say has done a lot, wanted to do more, failed to do more. The civil rights movement achieved much. I mean, again, you can look at the credit the civil rights movement must have seen, even the brave men and women who were involved in it, in taking on huge risk and arrest and mistreatment to try and make their point, and risking death, and we see that people were killed. So successes were made. Segregation in the South was tackled, voting restrictions were removed, but the USA remained this fundamentally unequal place. There was evidence that in particular regions, amongst many key institutions, notably law enforcement, and more broadly in American society, attitudes had not changed. And whilst changing rules on segregation and rules on voting could be done, addressing the underlying economic and social disadvantages was far more costly and more difficult, and this issue wasn't solved across the northern and southern states during this period of time. Arguably, many of these issues remain today. The movement itself also became divided between moderate and radical wings. I mean, it had been divided between moderate and radical wings before. We see a shift, so we move on to away from the division with Malcolm X and King, and then this growth of the movement towards Black Power on Stokely Carmichael. And we'll see that develop as we go into the late 60s and into the 70s, and the overwhelmingly during this period we see with particularly the predominance of King and the SCLC, we see a degree of resentment amongst other groups, notably SNCC, against them in terms of that they see this one man and one group seems to get the credit and all the funding. And a lot of the people on the ground who were doing a lot of the work were not. So I hope that's been helpful for you and given you a bit of insight into civil rights during this period. If you like it, please hit the like. If you have any comments or questions, please leave those below. And if you haven't already subscribed to Alan History Nerd, please do. There's plenty more videos on this part of American history. There's also stuff there on UK and American politics, designed for A-level politics, and there's also other areas of history covered, notably the Tudors, modern Britain, and various others. So if you have enjoyed this video, check out some others. Thank you very much for watching.